I went back to my father's place for 3 days. My husband sent my suitcase to me with a note. Get out and don't come back. I smiled disdainfully and did one thing. The next day, he was on his knees crying and begging for my forgiveness. My name is Isabella. I turned 34 this year and I am the chief accountant for a major construction firm in Chicago. My job is incredibly demanding. My mind is always pushed to the limit, navigating between ledgers, contracts, and payroll, reviewing every single figure, one by one. But no matter how exhausting the outside world was, I always told myself that coming home meant I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. I had a family to return to, a husband with whom I built a life of mutual support. My husband's name is Matthew. Looking from the outside, almost anyone would describe him as a good, mature, and easygoing guy. During our 6 years of marriage, I believed that too. I thought I was a lucky woman to have married a man who didn't drink himself into oblivion, didn't gamble, and didn't scream at his wife in the middle of the street. But only those who live under the same roof know that some marriages don't break apart because of one massive blowout. Instead, they cool down gradually until sleeping next to each other feels like sleeping next to a stranger. For about 6 months, Matthew had noticeably changed. He started leaving early and coming home late. His phone was always locked with a new passcode and placed face down on the table, as if he were terrified someone might catch a glimpse of the screen. One day, as I walked near him, he snatched up his phone, stood up, and went out to the balcony to take a call. When I asked him about it, I only got clipped responses. It's just work. Stop imagining things. I'm just really tired. I wasn't the type of woman to interrogate him, and I certainly didn't want to turn into a paranoid wife. So, many times, even though my gut told me something was off, I swallowed my doubts. I comforted myself by thinking he was probably just stressed with his job, that men his age carry a lot of professional weight. As his wife, I felt I needed to be more understanding, give him some grace. I kept yielding, backing down until that one morning. It was a completely normal morning. I remember perfectly well that I was in the kitchen, chopping some chives to sprinkle over Matthew's scrambled eggs and bacon. Matthew was sitting at the kitchen island, his eyes glued to his phone, chewing his food almost without realizing what he was eating. The silence in the house was so heavy you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. At that exact moment, my cell phone rang. It was my cousin, Paul. He rarely called me directly, especially not this early. As soon as I saw his name on the screen, my heart dropped. I barely got the phone to my ear when I heard his frantic, distorted voice on the other end. Bella, Uncle Philip had a stroke. We're in the ambulance heading to the hospital. You need to get here right now. Hurry. I felt the knife slip from my hand, hitting the granite countertop with a sharp clack. I froze. A ringing filled my ears, and I could only catch fragments of his words. Emergency room. We don't know anything yet. Get here fast. My dad, Philip, at 63, had been a strong man his whole life. He lived in a rural town in Wisconsin, about a 3-hour drive from Chicago. He was always active, rarely sick. I never imagined the day would come when I'd get the call that he had just collapsed. I spun around suddenly, my voice shaking so badly I barely recognized it myself. Matt. My dad had a stroke. I have to leave right now. Matthew looked up, stared at me for exactly 2 seconds, and then set his phone on the table. I expected a question, a show of concern, or at the very least how is he? Let me drive you. But no. He just frowned slightly and delivered a sentence that made my blood run cold. Well, go then. Go fast and come back soon so it doesn't mess up your work. I stood paralyzed. In that instant, I couldn't comprehend how the man who slept beside me every night could say something so callous while my father was being rushed to the ER. His tone wasn't loud or aggressive, but that casual indifference hurt more than any scream. I looked at him, wanting to say something, but it felt like invisible hands were choking me. And once again, I held my tongue. I thought maybe he was stressed about some corporate issue, that maybe men just process these things differently. My family was in absolute chaos in that moment. I didn't want to add a marital fight to the mix. I ran to the bedroom, changed my clothes, threw a couple of things into an overnight duffel bag, grabbed my phone charger and my driver's license. My hands were shaking so violently it took me 3 tries to zip the bag shut. But bizarrely, in the midst of that burning anguish, I didn't forget my wifely duties. I went back to the kitchen, turned off the stove, put the leftovers in the fridge, and reminded my husband that there was a big container of beef chili in the refrigerator. He just had to microwave it for dinner. I even took a moment to fold the laundry I had pulled from the dryer the night before, leaving it neatly on the bed. Looking back on it now, I see myself as both pathetic and ridiculous. My father was hovering between life and death in a hospital bed, and I was worried about keeping the house tidy and making sure my husband had a hot dinner. Before leaving, I dragged my bag to the front door. Matthew was still sitting there, head down, scrolling on his phone. I said quietly, "I'm heading to the hospital to be with Dad for a few days. I'll call you if there's any news." He didn't look up. He just let out an mm, a sound so light and distant it was as if the person walking out the door wasn't his wife, but a housekeeper asking for the weekend off. I got into my car with a heart like a stone. During the entire drive up, I 90 toward Wisconsin. The sky was gray, the clouds hung low, and the wind battered the windows. I gripped the steering wheel, calling my cousin nonstop, begging for updates on my dad's condition. But the more I called, the more anxious I became, because nobody could give me anything but vague reassurances. "He's in the ICU. You just need to get here. We can't say anything for sure yet." At a red light, I caught my reflection in the window and felt a knot form in my throat. Suddenly, I remembered Matthew's freezing stare from that morning. I wondered if I was being overly sensitive. Maybe my intense fear for my dad was making me see ghosts. I forced myself to believe that everything would be fine, that as soon as my dad pulled through and I went back home, life would return to normal. But a woman's intuition is a strange thing. It was a dull ache in my chest, formless and wordless, just a deep, unsettling anxiety that rode shotgun with me the entire trip. When I arrived at the hospital, I sprinted toward the intensive care unit. Seeing my cousin and other relatives waiting with devastated expressions made my legs buckle. When the heavy double doors opened for a split second, I saw my father lying there, eyes closed, his body hooked up to a mess of wires and tubes. I couldn't hold it in anymore and broke down crying right there in the hallway. Every thought about my job, my house, or my husband vanished into thin air. There was only one thing left in my world. Nothing could happen to my dad. I promised myself that no matter what, I would stay by his side for at least 3 days, or however long it took. I had absolutely no idea that during those very same days, while I was running myself ragged in a hospital ward, behind my back, my seemingly stable 6-year marriage was being coldly dismantled, piece by piece, setting me up for a shock I would never forget for the rest of my life. Sitting next to my father's bed, enveloped by the sharp, sterile smell of bleach and antiseptic, I realized how unpredictable life truly is. Just the day before, my dad had called to ask if I was coming up for a Sunday roast. His voice had echoed loud and clear, asking if I was working too much, telling me I sounded tired. And now, after one single phone call, he lay motionless in an ICU bed, his skin pale and gray. I sat next to him, holding his veiny hand in mine, while my other hand adjusted his blanket or nervously tapped the edge of the chair as I stared at the vital signs monitor. My mother died when I was young, so my dad had been both father and mother to me. He wasn't a man of poetic words, but he lived his entire life for his little girl. When I was away at college, he'd go out of his way to mail me care packages with homemade jams and sharp cheddar from the local dairy. When I got married, he drained his modest savings to give me a lump sum of cash. "So you have something to start with, so you can walk into your new home with your head held high," he had told me. Seeing him lying there broke me. I practically didn't sleep that first night. When the nurses finished adjusting his IVs, I stood guard. If a doctor walked past, I jumped up to ask questions. Sometimes sheer exhaustion would take over, and I'd rest my head on the edge of the mattress for 10 minutes, only to jolt awake at the slightest beep from the machines. Amidst that hurricane of anxiety, I was also waiting for a call from my husband. After all, my dad was his father-in-law, a man who had treated him like a son. But strangely, throughout the entire first day, Matthew never called. Almost at nightfall, my phone screen finally lit up with a blunt text message. "How's your dad?" Just 3 words, not a single follow-up question, not an ounce of comfort. I read the text feeling a mix of profound sadness and disappointment, but I still told myself he was probably swamped at work and typed it in a rush. I replied with a long paragraph detailing my dad's condition, the doctor's prognosis, the medications, the message delivered, and much later, the read receipt appeared. It was followed by absolute silence. I sat quietly by the window in the hospital corridor. Outside, the sky turned pitch black, and a draft seeped through the glass, chilling my bones. I suddenly remembered our early days as newlyweds. My dad had caught a bad chest cold, and Matthew took it upon himself to drive up, bringing soup and cough syrup, spending the whole afternoon checking on him. My dad appreciated it so much. He used to say, "That Matt is a good kid." He doesn't say much, but he's got a good heart. I believed it too. I thought I had married the right man. That was why Matthew's icy demeanor over the last few months, and his absolute apathy that morning, felt like a thorn lodged deep in my chest that I couldn't pull out. By the second day, my dad's condition remained critical. He showed signs of responding to the treatment, but he hadn't fully regained consciousness. I took advantage of a moment when the doctors finished their rounds to step out into the hallway and call Matthew. I didn't want to argue. I just desperately needed to see his face, to hear one kind word in the middle of this nightmare. I hit FaceTime. After several rings, he answered, but the screen was pitch black. His voice sounded deeply irritated. "I'm in a meeting." "What is it?" "I just wanted to tell you how Dad is doing, and that I miss you," I said, a lump forming in my throat on the last few words. There was a 2-second pause on the line, and then Matthew replied sharply, "I'm really busy. We'll talk tonight." But right at that moment, behind his voice, I didn't hear the shuffling of corporate papers or the hushed tension of a boardroom. I clearly heard, though faintly, the upbeat rhythm of pop music in the background, followed by a woman's laugh. It was fleeting, but it was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. "Are you really in a meeting?" I asked immediately. Matthew flared up instantly. "If you don't believe me, that's your problem. Don't use your dad's health as an excuse to pick fights with me." And with that, he hung up. I stood dead center in the hospital corridor, the phone still pressed to my hand, my ears ringing. In the past, no matter how angry he got, Matthew had never spoken to me in that tone. The creeping anxiety from the day before exploded into a massive, jagged suspicion that embedded itself in my brain. I walked back to my plastic chair, trying to gaslight myself into thinking I heard it wrong. Maybe it was a TV in a waiting room, maybe he really was in a crowded lobby. But the harder I tried to excuse him, the more exhausted I felt. Around noon, while waiting for the results of a neuroconsult, I opened my Chase banking app to check our balances, knowing a long hospital stay would mean unexpected expenses. My personal checking account was normal, but when I swiped over to our joint savings account, I saw a massive withdrawal had just cleared. I bolted upright. We weren't talking about a few $100 for groceries. It was a sum large enough that any wife would demand immediate answers. I dialed Matthew's number. This time, he picked up quickly, but his voice was dripping with annoyance, like I was interrupting something incredibly important. "You just pulled a huge amount of cash from our joint account," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Did an emergency come up?" Matthew was silent for a beat, then responded with absolute frost. "Yeah. I transferred some of our money for my own expenses." "Why are you asking so many questions?" I felt an Arctic chill wash over me. In 6 years of marriage, he had never spoken to me like this. For all those years, any major purchase was discussed not to ask for permission, but out of mutual respect. And today, he said it with total entitlement, as if he had earned every penny himself and I had no right to even look at the ledger. "What did you just say?" I asked. My voice barely a whisper. He grew even more agitated. "I'm busy. Worry about your dad. I'll handle the money." He hung up again. I sat there staring at the darkened screen of my iPhone, my heart turning to ice. That sentence didn't just shock me because of the money. It felt like he had violently ripped away the last layer of decency I was still trying to project onto him in my mind. Later that afternoon, as I was helping a nurse adjust my dad's pillows, my phone buzzed. It was Lucy, my best friend since our undergrad days at Northwestern. Her text was short, but reading it sent a shudder down my spine. "Bella, is something going on with Matt? I've seen him around town a few times lately with some girl I don't recognize." At first, I thought it was a client, so I didn't say anything. But the vibe was really weird. I stared at those words for a long time. So long that Lucy sent a follow-up. "If I'm overstepping, ignore me. But I think you need to keep your eyes open." My hands shook. If it was just his cold attitude, I could still lie to myself. If it was just a weird bank transfer, I could assume he was dealing with an investment. But when someone outside your marriage sees your husband out with another woman, you can no longer force yourself to believe in coincidences. Even then, my brain refused to fully accept it. I told myself I had to stay calm, that I needed to verify everything, because my dad was still in a hospital bed and I could not afford a mental breakdown. By the end of the second day, I was physically and mentally shattered. On the third day, thank God, my dad's condition finally began to stabilize. The neurologist told us he was out of the immediate woods and just needed observation before starting light rehab. Hearing those words, I almost collapsed in tears of relief. For the first time in 72 hours, I felt like I could take a deep breath. I calculated in my head, if my dad remained stable tonight, I would drive back to Chicago tomorrow morning, grab more clothes, and see with my own eyes what the hell was going on in my house. That evening, sitting by his bed, I sent Matthew a very brief text. Coming home tomorrow. I didn't accuse him, didn't ask questions, just those 3 words. An hour passed. Then 2. The entire evening slipped by without a reply. The screen remained terrifyingly silent, and a sickening premonition began to bloom in my gut. I knew that when I walked through my front door tomorrow, I would likely face something far worse than I had imagined. The next morning, after the doctor made his rounds and confirmed Dad was stable enough to be moved to a regular step-down room, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I had barely slept the night before, terrified of a secondary stroke. Hearing the doctor say the immediate danger was over made my knees weak. As I helped my dad drink a little water, I asked my cousin to go downstairs and handle the transfer paperwork. I started packing up the few things I had scattered around the folding recliner by the bed. Just as I was folding a blanket, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown Chicago number. I hesitated, thinking it might be hospital billing or someone from my office, so I answered. On the other end, a young guy spoke quickly. Isabella? I've got a delivery for you. A suitcase. Sender is Matthew. Could you come down to the main hospital entrance to sign for it? I froze. A suitcase? Sent by Matthew? A fleeting, desperately optimistic thought crossed my mind. Maybe he realized I've been up here for days, knew I needed fresh clothes, and overnighted my bag. Despite the rage and coldness of the last few days, I forced myself to reach for the kindest explanation. I even felt a twinge of bitter relief, thinking maybe he had finally remembered how to be a husband. I asked my aunt to watch my dad for a minute and hurried down to the lobby. Even though it was morning, the air outside was thick and humid. The constant hum of automatic sliding doors and the wail of a distant ambulance made my already exhausted brain throb. The courier, standing next to a beat-up sedan, saw me approach and handed over a dark gray hardshell carry-on. It was the exact suitcase I always used for quick corporate trips. Seeing it, my stomach dropped. Are you sure this is for me? Matthew sent this. Really? I asked, needing to be sure. The guy scratched his head and showed me his phone screen. The sender's name was indeed Matthew, and his cell number was right there. No mistake. I signed for it, feeling a toxic mix of confusion and dread. The suitcase didn't feel as heavy as I expected, but it hung from my arm in an awkward, lopsided way. I didn't take it straight up to the room. I don't know why, but in that moment, a dark, suffocating feeling washed over me, like ice water spilling down my spine. I dragged the suitcase to a quiet corner of the lobby near the stairwell, away from the foot traffic. The harsh fluorescent lights bounced off the polished linoleum, making the metallic zippers of the bag gleam with a blinding coldness. I took a deep breath, crouched down, and with trembling hands, unzipped the bag. As soon as the lid fell open, I turned to stone. Inside, there weren't a few carefully folded outfits for a wife taking care of her sick father. It was all my personal belongings, violently shoved in. Pajamas, blouses, jeans, my expensive lingerie all tangled together. Even the cashmere scarf I kept neatly in my drawer was crumpled into a ball. A bottle of expensive face serum had popped open, staining one of my white work shirts. A red lipstick rolled into the corner, and the bottle of Advil from my nightstand had been tossed in like garbage. The way these things were packed wasn't the work of someone sending care luggage. It was the work of someone evicting a person. I stayed completely still, my mind entirely blank, my eyes glued to that chaotic pile of fabric. It took me a few seconds to register that sitting right on top of the mess was a piece of paper, folded in half. I pulled it out. The paper was creased. The handwriting was jagged and aggressive, the pen pressed so hard it almost tore the sheet. There was only one line, "Get out and don't come back." A high-pitched ringing pierced my ears. All the sounds around me, the chatter, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the intercom vanished. There was only that sentence, growing larger in front of my eyes. "Get out and don't come back." No explanation. No final argument. 6 years of marriage, and in the end, he was kicking me out with a courier delivery and a post-it note, like he was tossing out an old piece of furniture. My hands shook so violently the paper rattled. My chest ached like someone was physically crushing my ribs. If anyone had seen me at that moment, they would have thought I had just received news worse than my father's stroke. I wanted to cry. I genuinely did. I wanted to scream right there in the lobby, call him, demand an explanation, scream in his face asking what I had ever done to deserve being treated like a dog. But strangely, that overwhelming hysteria only lasted a few seconds. Right after the initial shock, a terrifying, absolute cold seized my body. The tears that were about to fall retreated. I stood up straight, looked down at my ruined clothes, and then at the note in my hand. All the puzzle pieces from the last few months, as if someone had violently slammed them together, formed a crystal-clear, brutal picture. His prolonged coldness, the hidden phone calls, the new passcode, the unprovoked hostility, the massive withdrawal from the joint account, the woman's laugh on FaceTime, Lucy's text seeing him with another girl, and his chilling silence after my text, "Coming home tomorrow." This wasn't an emotional outburst. This wasn't a temporary fight. He had planned this. He likely waited for the exact moment my dad fell critically ill, the moment I would be most vulnerable, distracted, and weak to land the kill shot. This suitcase wasn't an impulse. It was the finale he had orchestrated. The more I thought about it, the colder I got. The man who had slept next to me for years proved that, when he decided to turn his back, he could do it with sociopathic efficiency. I pulled out my phone and dialed Matthew's number. It didn't even finish the first ring before it went to voicemail. He had declined it. I called again. Busy signal. On the third try, the phone was turned off completely. That action was the final slap to the face, decisive and totally unapologetic. He wasn't just throwing me out. He wasn't even going to give me the dignity of a single word. I sat in silence for a few more seconds. Then, I slowly folded the note and slid it into my purse. I zipped up the suitcase and leaned it against the wall. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't panicking. In my mind, there was only a glacial clarity that honestly terrified even me. I stared down the long, empty hospital corridor, and a tiny smirk so small only I knew it was there curled my lips. "So, you want to throw me out?" I thought. I gripped the handle of the suitcase tightly, my eyes losing every shred of warmth. "Then you better not regret it." I didn't take the suitcase back up to the room. I knew if my dad or my family saw that pile of clothes treated like trash alongside that note, World War III would break out right there in the ward. My dad had just survived a stroke. He couldn't handle another spike in blood pressure. I checked the bag at the hospital's security desk. I went to the lobby restroom, splashed freezing water on my face, and stared at my reflection. My skin was pale, dark circles bruised my eyes, my lips were cracked. I looked like a survivor of a hurricane, but it was in that exact moment, when I looked like I was about to shatter, that my brain fired on all cylinders. I knew I couldn't just speed back to Chicago in a blind rage. A man who dares to courier his wife's clothes to a hospital is ruthless enough to scrub his house of any evidence within hours. If I wanted to know exactly what game he was playing, I needed recon before I sounded the alarm. I pulled out my phone and dialed Lucy. She picked up on the first ring, words tumbling out. "Bella! What's up? Is your dad okay?" I took a deep breath and gave her the rundown, fast and clinical. I told her about the suitcase, the note, the blocked phone. Dead silence fell over the line for several seconds before Lucy let out a string of curses I had rarely heard her use in the 10 years I'd known her. Then, her voice dropped to a serious whisper. "Bella, do not drive home yet. Let me drive by your house first and see what the hell is going on." I clung to that sentence like a life raft. "Go, please," I said, my voice low but steady. "Do not ring the bell. Don't let him know you're there. Just see if anyone is inside. If anything looks wrong. And call me back." Lucy didn't ask questions. I'm on my way. From the moment I hung up until the moment she called back, every minute felt like an eternity. I sat in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, squeezing my phone so hard my knuckles went numb. Outside, the sun was beating down, casting swaying shadows across the parking lot. People came and went. But to me, it was all a blur. My brain was locked onto one single question. What the hell is happening inside my house? Almost 40 minutes later, my phone vibrated. It was Lucy. She didn't FaceTime and she didn't text. She called standard voice, her tone so hushed it was barely a breath. Bella, there's a woman inside your house. A shiver shot down my spine. Who? I demanded instantly. Lucy hesitated. I didn't get a perfect look at her face at first, but she looks incredibly familiar. Like really familiar. I jumped to my feet. Take a picture. However, you have to do it from the street, through the fence, the bay window, just get her face. Okay, hold on, she whispered, hanging up. I stood paralyzed next to the vending machines, my heart hammering against my ribs. A woman in my house. Right after he shipped my suitcase away, putting those two things together meant this was no longer just a failing marriage. He was replacing me. But even though I had braced myself, when the photo finally came through iMessage, it felt like someone swung a baseball bat into my skull. The first picture was slightly blurry, taken through the wrought iron fence aiming at the living room window. It showed a woman in profile with long hair holding a coffee mug. The second was clearer. In the third, when she turned fully toward the glass, I stopped breathing. It was Chloe. I had to zoom in on the photo 3 times to believe my own eyes. Chloe, a former junior accountant from my old firm whom I had personally trained when she was fresh out of college. The same girl who had once sat in my office crying about her mother's medical bills, swearing she just needed a stable job to survive. Once, she made a catastrophic error on a major client invoice, and I took the heat for it so she wouldn't get fired. And now, the woman standing in my living room was her. I hadn't even processed the shock when Lucy sent another photo. An image so high definition it burned my retinas. Chloe was wearing the cream-colored silk pajamas with lace trim that I kept in my top drawer. I recognized them instantly because I had bought them myself with my end-of-year bonus. I remembered agonizing over the price tag for days. She was wearing my clothes, walking around my house with her hair down, moving with a casual arrogance that screamed she had been comfortable there for a long time. A knot formed in my throat not from surprise anymore, but from sheer, unadulterated humiliation. A freezing humiliation that seeped into my scalp. Lucy wasn't imagining things. I didn't mishear the laugh on the video call. While I was sitting in a hospital waiting room shaking with fear for my father, this girl was casually slipping into my silk pajamas, taking my place, playing house like she had won the jackpot. My phone rang. It was Lucy again. Her voice was shaking with pure rage. Bella, it gets worse. I was near the driveway. She just introduced herself to Mrs. Higgins next door is his fiancé. I closed my eyes. Lucy kept venting, choking on her anger. Mrs. Higgins literally asked, "Wait, what about your wife?" And Matt just laughed it off and said, "We split up a while ago, just bringing someone new in to settle down. Do you realize what a sociopath this guy is?" I didn't answer right away. I just gripped the phone tighter. If this had happened 3 days ago, I probably would have collapsed in tears. If I were a different woman, I might have driven straight to Chicago, dragged her out by her hair, and smashed every window in that house to let it out. But in that moment, I couldn't cry. I felt the pain, I felt the humiliation, but above all, I felt a clarity so cold it frightened me. "Lucy," I said steadily, "go home. Do not let them see you. Save all those photos to the cloud. Don't delete a single one." She tried to say something else, but hearing my tone, she just sighed. "Okay, but Bella, you have to be strong. This piece of trash isn't worth you breaking down." After hanging up, I sat in silence for a solid 10 minutes. Then, I unlocked my phone and began checking every single digital footprint I had. First, the house. The deed was in both our names. I remembered that perfectly because the day we closed, my dad pulled me aside and told me, "No matter how much you love him, make sure the paperwork is 50/50. Then, the joint savings. Then, our mutual brokerage accounts. I opened the Chase app, the Fidelity app, scrolled through old emails, checked scanned documents in my Google Drive. The more I looked, the sicker I felt. There were transfers from months ago, not just recent days. There were alerts I had swiped away because I trusted my husband to handle the day-to-day trading. Now, looking at them, the amounts were staggering. I vaguely remembered Matthew telling me he was moving some mutual funds around for tax purposes. I hadn't bothered to ask for the details. Now, I realized he had been secretly siphoning our marital assets into accounts I couldn't see. I looked up at the glaring afternoon sun bleeding through the hospital windows, and my entire life came into sharp focus. There was no ambiguity anymore. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden midlife crisis. Matthew had planned this for months. Every dollar, every document, every lie was meticulously laid out to pave the way for his mistress to move in. He had lined up all his ducks. I squeezed the phone in my hand. The agony was still there, but the weakness was gone, because I finally understood the truth. That man no longer saw me as his wife. I was an obstacle to be neutralized. And if I stayed soft, if I hesitated for 1 second, he was going to steal my entire life right out from under me. I stayed in that hospital corridor a while longer, leaning against the cold drywall, watching my screen go dark. When a woman discovers her husband is not only cheating on her but is actively moving his mistress into her home, the first reaction is always grief. But when the grief burns off, what remains is raw, tactical clarity. And I knew exactly what would happen if I lost my mind, drove home, and threw a screaming, crying fit. I would look like the crazy, hysterical ex. Matthew was banking on that. He was waiting for me to lose control and create a domestic disturbance so he'd have an excuse to call the cops, file a restraining order, and legally lock me out. Meanwhile, he'd sit comfortably in our house with our money, playing the victimized good guy to the neighborhood. Thinking about that, I stood up, rolled my shoulders back, and opened my contacts. There was a man I hadn't spoken to in a couple of years, but his name flashed brightly in my mind. Mark, a senior attorney and an old family friend, a few years older than me. Years ago, he had helped my cousin navigate a vicious, high-stakes divorce where her ex tried to hide assets in offshore LLCs. I still remember my cousin crying her eyes out while her ex played poor. It was Mark who, by forensically tracking every bank wire and deed, forced the guy to surrender everything he stole. I dialed his number without hesitation. He picked up quickly, his voice as deep, clear, and unbothered as ever. Isabella, to what do I owe the pleasure at this hour? Hearing his calm voice almost made the dam break, but I swallowed the emotion. I told him I was at a hospital in Wisconsin with my dad, and then I laid out the entire situation from start to finish. I gave him the facts. Matthew's coldness, the drained joint account, the suitcase sent to the hospital, the eviction note, and Lucy's photos of Chloe walking around my house in my clothes. When I finished, there was a heavy silence on the line. Then Mark spoke, slowly, every word acting like a bucket of ice water. Do you have the texts, the transfer screenshots, the photos of her in the house, and the handwritten note? Yes, everything is backed up, I replied instantly. He's not just cheating on you, Isabella, Mark said with chilling precision. He is attempting a constructive eviction and trying to force you to abandon the marriage without triggering a legal division of marital assets. I gripped the phone. Even though I suspected it, hearing a ruthless lawyer confirm it made it real. Mark didn't let me wallow. He fired off questions rapidly. Who is on the deed? What bank holds the joint accounts? Are there any joint investments? Has Matthew ever had you sign documents without letting you read them thoroughly? I answered as best as I could. The more I answered, the colder my spine got. I had blindly trusted him with tax returns and refinancing papers. Things that now reeked of premeditation. Rule number 1, Mark commanded. Do not send him a single angry text. Rule number 2, email me every piece of evidence you have right now. Rule number 3, freeze everything you legally have access to immediately. How do I do that? I asked. My breathing shallow. He gave me rapid-fire instructions. I needed to call Chase and flag the joint account for suspicious activity to freeze it, request an expedited statement of all recent transfers, and pull every PDF, tax return, and digital file I had in my email. I had to secure them on a separate cloud drive before he tried to change my passwords. Right there in the hospital stairwell, I went to war. I opened every app and forwarded everything to Mark. I sent the bank wire screenshots, the photos of Chloe. Looking at those pictures of my house made me physically nauseous, but the sicker I felt, the faster I worked. I realized I couldn't afford to be fragile. My dad had just survived the worst day of his life. I was not going to let some scumbag drag me into the dirt, too. Half an hour later, Mark called back. His tone was noticeably grimmer. "Isabella, I've done a preliminary sweep of public records and the documents you sent. There are several highly suspicious wire transfers, but there is something much, much worse." My stomach dropped. "What?" I whispered. "It appears Matthew has applied for a massive home equity line of credit, a HELOC, using your primary residence as collateral," he said slowly, as if bracing me for impact. "I don't have the final underwriter documents yet, but the electronic trail is blazing red." I couldn't speak. So this wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just him tossing his wife out to play house with his side piece. He was digging a massive, filthy financial crater. "What does that mean for me?" I asked, my mouth dry. "It means," Mark said bluntly, "that if you roll over, if you walk away quietly to avoid the drama, he will likely finalize that loan behind your back. You won't just lose your house and your savings, you'll be legally saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt that he created." My hands went numb. The suitcase, the note, Chloe's smug face in my window, it all merged into a terrifyingly clear picture. Matthew wasn't kicking me out because he fell out of love. He was kicking me out because I was a liability to his scam. He needed me out of the house, preferably hysterical and distracted, so he had free rein to liquidate our equity. The more I processed it, the more I wanted to vomit. 6 years of sharing a bed, and in his eyes, I wasn't a human being. I was a signature on a loan document. A financial shield. Trash to be taken out. Mark continued giving me strict orders. "Keep this completely hidden from my dad. Under no circumstances confront Matthew without hard leverage. And most importantly, do not let Matthew know I was auditing him. The calmer you appear, the easier it is to let him hang himself," Mark said. "Arrogant guys like him get sloppy when they think you're weak." I absorbed every word, and my mind went totally dark and clear. He was right. I couldn't fight like a heartbroken wife. I had to fight like someone dismantling a hostile corporate takeover. I hung up the phone and sat in silence. In the hallway, the night shift fluorescent lights flickered on, making the floor look like a sheet of ice. But inside me, a fire had gone out, and something entirely different had ignited. I was no longer the woman praying her husband would text her back, nor was I the woman trembling over a ruined suitcase. I unlocked my phone, transferred the final documents to the encrypted folder, and looked out at the black sky through the window. A faint smile, so cold it felt alien to my own face, crept onto my lips. "Did you think throwing me out was the end of it, Matt?" I thought, my grip tightening on the phone. "I am not going to rest until you are the one begging on your knees." I didn't say it to hype myself up. I said it to cement the fact that from this second forward, every move I made had to be calculated, lethal, and colder than him. That night, after my dad fell asleep, I slipped into the hall and called Mark again. I told him I wasn't waiting. The house was marital property, and I was going back tomorrow to see the crime scene with my own eyes. But I also knew that if I went alone, Matthew would absolutely claim I broke in to attack him and twist the narrative. Mark listened and simply said, "I'll pick you up tomorrow morning. I'll notify the local precinct for a civil standby, so there's a police record of a property dispute. Do not touch him. Do not say anything he can record. Remember, you are there to collect evidence, not to win a screaming match. Understood?" "Understood," I replied, and hung up. I spent the night sitting next to my dad. But my mind was no longer trapped in the despair of the previous days. The grief was there, but it was locked away, making room for a razor-sharp focus. The next morning, I asked my cousin and my aunt to take over dad duty for the day. My dad was still weak, but seeing me change into a sharp blazer and slacks, he asked softly, "Where are you going, sweetheart?" I leaned down and adjusted his blanket, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I have to run back to Chicago to grab some paperwork and proper clothes, Dad. I'll be back tonight." He nodded weakly. I turned around fast, because if I stayed for one more second, he would have seen the absolute murder in my eyes. Mark arrived on time. He drove a sleek black Audi, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, exuding an aura of untouchable calm. During the drive down from Wisconsin, he reiterated the rules. No violence, no threats, and do not reveal the hand we were holding. Sitting in the passenger seat, watching the familiar exit signs for the Chicago suburbs flash by, everything felt bizarrely foreign. I had driven this route hundreds of times, yet today it felt like I was driving into enemy territory. When the car turned onto my tree-lined street, the first thing I noticed was the front door. The deadbolt and handle were brand new, bright, shiny brass. My blood spiked. Matthew hadn't just shipped my clothes. He had illegally changed the locks on a house I owned. I stared at the lock for 2 seconds, then walked right up to the door and hit the doorbell. Once, twice, 3 times. There was silence inside, followed by the soft shuffling of slippers. The door cracked open, and standing right in front of me was Chloe. And what made my fists clench wasn't just her face, it was the silk pajamas she was wearing. Mi pajamas. The delicate lace trim, the little silk tie at the waist. Chloe leaned against the doorframe, looked me up and down, and smirked. That smile had nothing to do with the timid, stressed-out junior accountant I used to know. It was arrogant, defiant, and nauseating. Wow, you actually had the nerve to show up? She drawled, dragging out the syllables like she was trying to carve them into my forehead. I thought you'd have taken the hint by now. A few months ago, I might have slapped her across the face. But right then, I felt eerily serene. I stared directly into her eyes, unblinking, and spoke in a voice like liquid nitrogen. This is my house. You are just the trash that snuck in through the back door. Move out of my way. Chloe's smug expression instantly vanished. Before she could snap back, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Matthew appeared. He was wearing sweatpants and a gray t-shirt, his hair tousled like he had just rolled out of my bed. But what disgusted me wasn't his appearance, it was his eyes. There was no trace of the nice guy left. He looked at me with blatant contempt, his lips curling into a sneer. I already gave you your stuff. Get the hell out of here. Why are you back? He demanded. Before I could speak, Mark stepped up beside me. He opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a copy of the property deed, and spoke with loud, absolute authority. Mr. Matthew, last name. This property is a jointly owned marital asset legally belonging to you and your wife. The fact that you have unilaterally changed the locks and are denying entry to the co-owner constitutes an illegal lockout. We have already notified the local police precinct of a civil dispute. Step aside and allow us entry immediately. Hearing the word police, Matthew's eyes darted nervously. It was just a micro-expression, but I saw the panic. Chloe whipped her head toward him, her voice suddenly shrill. Wait, you told me she couldn't do anything. Why did she bring a lawyer? She slapped a hand over her mouth, realizing she just slipped up, but it was too late. That instant reaction confirmed it. They both genuinely believed I would just cry in a hospital and let them have my house. Matthew stood frozen for a second, then grudgingly backed away. I stepped into my home. The moment my foot hit the hardwood of the living room, a sharp pain hit me, not out of weakness, but from the sheer audacity of what I was looking at. Our large wedding portrait had been ripped off the wall. In its place was a tasteless canvas print. Under the coffee table were a pair of pink fuzzy slippers. A makeup bag and a pearl hair claw were tossed onto my sofa. It wasn't just that she was using the space. She was aggressively marking her territory, rubbing my nose in the fact that I had been replaced. I stood dead center in the room. Matthew was probably hoping I'd go feral. Chloe was probably waiting for a screaming match so she could record it and play the victim. I gave them nothing. I simply pulled out my iPhone, hit record, and slowly panned across the room. The foyer, the slippers, the missing photo, Chloe in my pajamas. Nobody dared to stop me. The silence was so heavy you could hear everyone breathing. When I finished, I lowered the phone, locked eyes with Matthew, and said in a tone so conversational we could have been chatting at a Starbucks. Perfect. The messier you make this, the harder it will be for you to look the judge in the eye. I watched Matthew's face drop. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a flash of genuine dread he tried desperately to suppress. And for the first time in days, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the one being evicted anymore. I was back, and I was going to scorch the earth. My words left a suffocating tension in the living room. Matthew didn't respond, but his clenched jaw and narrowed eyes told me he was rattled. Chloe was still trying to maintain a tough facade, but her hands were gripping the armrest of the sofa so hard her knuckles were bone white. I ignored them both. Gripping my purse, I walked straight down the hall to the master bedroom. As soon as I pushed the door open, my stomach rolled. The room was the same, the bed, the dressers, but it felt violated. A drawer was left half open, closet doors were ajar, and what made my blood freeze was seeing the small, built-in wall safe inside the closet completely exposed. I rushed over and yanked it open. Empty. Several heavy manila envelopes I kept in a blue plastic sleeve were gone. Specifically, the folder containing the financial records of the premarital cash gift my parents had given me. The money my dad had scraped together, telling me it was my safety net. I distinctly remembered placing those documents in the back of that safe, and now they were gone. I whipped around. Matthew had followed me to the doorway, while Chloe lingered nervously behind him. "Where are my documents?" I demanded, skipping the pleasantries. Matthew shrugged, feigning ignorance with a smirk so punchable it took everything in me to stay still. "Who knows what you hide in there? I haven't touched it." I let out a laugh, but it was so hollow and terrifying it startled me. If I hadn't seen the empty safe with my own eyes, I might have doubted myself. Mark stepped into the room, assessed the open safe, and asked quietly, "Do you have digital backups of those specific records?" I nodded. Out of pure muscle memory, I opened my phone to check my secure cloud drive. And in that exact fraction of a second, an automated email notification from Chase dropped down from the top of my screen. Just a few lines of text, but every word hit me like a sledgehammer. "Alert. Your e-signature has been successfully applied to loan origination document #774B. Your home equity line of credit application is proceeding to final underwriting." I stopped breathing. For a split second, I thought I was hallucinating. But no, I opened the email. It was an official confirmation that a massive loan, collateralized by the house I was standing in, was moving forward. My husband wasn't just cheating on me. He wasn't just locking me out and playing house with his side piece. He was trying to financially assassinate me, draining the equity of my home and shackling me to a six-figure debt I knew absolutely nothing about. I shoved the phone into Mark's hands. He zoomed in on the screen, his eyes scanning the text rapidly, and told me to forward him the attached PDF bundle immediately. A minute later, reviewing the digital PDFs on his tablet, Mark tapped the screen and said in a low, lethal voice, "Isabella, this signature is a forgery. It's not a live digital sign. There are pixelation artifacts." He lifted a JPEG of your signature from an old document and pasted it into a DocuSign envelope. A high-frequency ring started in my ears. My signature, stolen and pasted onto a legal document to mortgage the very roof over my head. I had to grip the edge of the dresser to keep from falling over. Mark kept swiping through the pages, stopping at the marital status declaration. His face turned to stone. This is incredibly sloppy. He's mixing forged digital stamps with wet signatures. A forensic handwriting expert will rip this to shreds in 5 minutes. His words threw me back to a few months ago. I remembered Matthew bringing me random tax forms or insurance updates to sign while I was exhausted. Once, I had just come back from a grueling 1-2 hour closeout at work, my head pounding. He shoved a pen in my hand and said, "Just sign this real quick. I need to FedEx it by 8 p.m. Blindly trusting my husband, I scribbled my name without reading the fine print. Remembering it now felt like taking a bullet to the chest. He had weaponized my trust, choosing the exact moments I was burned out to lay the traps for this scam. Mark scrolled down to the disbursement instructions. I leaned in. My heart stopped again. The primary beneficiary of the loan funds wasn't a bank or a standard contractor. It was a newly registered LLC. And listed as the registered agent of that LLC was Chloe. She wasn't just the girl he was sleeping with. She was a central co-conspirator in a plot to strip my assets, take my home, and leave me bankrupt. I turned around and marched back into the living room. Chloe was sitting there, but the smugness was totally wiped from her face. When she heard the words loan application and forged signature echo from the bedroom, all the color drained from her cheeks. Her eyes were darting frantically, her lips were dry, and her hands were clamped onto her knees. That physical reaction was all the confirmation I needed. She knew. She was in on it. She wasn't some naive 2-0, something getting played by an older married man. She was an active accomplice walking hand in hand with him through the mud. I stood right in front of them. I didn't yell, but every word hit like a brick. "You two aren't just having an affair. You're committing felony wire fraud." Chloe tried to stutter out a defense, but before she could, Matthew exploded. He slammed his hand against the wall, a dull, violent thud. The veins in his neck bulged, and his eyes went wild, the look of a cornered animal whose deepest secret had just been exposed. "So what?" he roared. "What the hell do you think you're gonna do? You think walking back in here means you win? To me, you've been nothing but an ATM for years." That sentence was a physical blow to my sternum. I thought I had grown completely numb, that I was ready, but hearing the man I called my husband admit out loud that I was nothing but a cash machine tore a hole right through me. 6 years. 6 years of paying the mortgage, cooking meals, building trust, trying to build a life. And to him, I was just a corporate paycheck to be exploited. But in that exact second, the very last microscopic drop of love I had for Matthew evaporated into nothing. I stared at him. No tears, no screaming, no shaking. I looked at him the way you look at a corpse. "You just dug your own grave, Matt," I said, my voice slower and colder than ice. This time, he went dead silent, and I knew the game had permanently shifted. This was no longer a messy divorce. It was a demolition, and he had just handed me the dynamite. Before Matthew could fire back, Mark shot me a look. I understood instantly. If I wanted to completely destroy him, I couldn't do it in a screaming match between 4 walls. A narcissist like Matthew could act tough in front of his mistress, but I knew he wouldn't survive being unmasked in front of his precious family. His reputation as the good son and great guy was his shield. I looked right at him. "If you're so confident that you're in the right, then call your mother and my uncle. Tell them to come over tonight so we can clear the air in front of everybody." Matthew flinched. He clearly didn't expect me to escalate it to the families so fast. Chloe whipped her head toward him, pure panic in her eyes. But after a few seconds, Matthew puffed out his chest and sneered. "Fine. Let's see if you actually have the guts." I nodded. I had nothing left to lose. I immediately called my uncle and told him to drive to the house that evening. I didn't give details. I just said there was a catastrophic family emergency that required witnesses. By 7 p.m., my Uncle David and Aunt Susan were in the living room. Shortly after, Matthew's mother, Patty, walked in. The moment Patty saw me, she shot me a venomous glare. Her lips were pursed, practically vibrating with the urge to insult me, and she didn't disappoint. Without even taking off her coat, she pointed a finger at me. "What are you doing back here? If my son doesn't want you, having a tantrum won't fix it. A woman who neglects her husband so badly he has to kick her out needs to take a hard look in the mirror." A few months ago, I would have bitten my tongue out of respect. Not tonight. I looked her dead in the eye, spine straight. "Your son isn't leaving me because he fell out of love, Patty. He's leaving me because he wants to steal the deed to this house, drain my bank accounts, and saddle me with massive fraudulent debt." My words landed like a grenade in the living room. The air vanished. My uncle froze halfway into his chair. My aunt stared at me in shock, then whipped her head toward Matthew. Matthew reacted with practiced speed, interrupting with a sickeningly fake, wounded tone. "Don't listen to her, Mom. She's delusional. She abandoned me. All she cares about is her accounting firm and her dad. I've suffered in silence for years. And now that I finally won out, she's trying to ruin me." He even forced a heavy sigh, rubbing his face like a broken man. "A wife who never cooks, never cleans, and can't even give me a child. How am I supposed to live like that?" My hands turned to ice. I knew he was a snake, but I never imagined he was depraved enough to use our fertility struggles, a deeply private pain, to weaponize his mother against me. My dad was in a hospital bed, and he was using my empty womb as a PR strategy. My aunt, furious, stood up to defend me, but Chloe beat her to it. She sidled up next to Matthew, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sympathy. "Isabella, when love dies, you just have to learn to let go. If you keep acting crazy, you're only making yourself look bad. A real woman knows when to walk away with dignity." I turned to look at her, and I laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a loud, sharp, chilling laugh that made even my uncle take a step back. I pulled out my phone and airdropped a folder to the smart TV in the living room. "I think it's better if we let the evidence do the talking tonight." I hit play on the audio I had secretly recorded earlier that afternoon. Matthew's voice blasted through the soundbar, crystal clear. To me, you've been nothing but an ATM for years. The room went dead. Matthew looked like someone had punched the oxygen out of his lungs. The color drained from his face, but I didn't give him a second to breathe. I swiped to the next slide. High-res screenshots of the massive wire transfers from our joint account. Next slide. The HELOC application showing my forged, pixelated signature. Next slide. Lucy's photos of Chloe casually lounging in my house, wearing my expensive pajamas. Days before I was officially kicked out, I narrated each slide like I was giving a corporate presentation. This is the $80,000 he drained from our savings. This is the forged signature he used to apply for a $200,000 loan against this house. This is a photo of his mistress living rent-free in my home while my father was in the ICU. Patty, who had walked in with her head held high, ready to defend her golden boy, started trembling. Her eyes darted from me to the TV, to Matthew. I knew she was a toxic mother-in-law who probably approved of him finding a new girl who could give him kids. But I also knew she had zero idea he was committing federal bank fraud. I looked at Patty, then at Matthew, my voice echoing off the walls. Cheating on me makes you garbage. But forging a signature, mortgaging marital property, and trying to pin a $250,000 debt on your wife? That's called a felony. The second I said the word felony, Matthew snapped. He lunged across the coffee table, trying to rip the phone out of my hands, but Mark moved incredibly fast, stepping directly between us. Mister? Last name, Mark said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. If you touch her, or if you attempt to destroy evidence in my presence, you will leave this house in handcuffs. Sit down. Matthew froze, his face purple with rage and humiliation. Beside him, Chloe completely lost her composure. Her fake sweet persona shattered. She spun on Matthew, her voice cracking in absolute panic. Matt! You told me that once she signed the divorce papers, the money was clear. Why is there a lawyer here with fraud documents? The room temperature dropped below zero. My uncle slammed his hand on the end table. My aunt gasped, and I just stared at Chloe's pale, terrified face. You just offered yourself up as the star witness, I thought. Matthew stared at Chloe, his eyes bulging like he wanted to strangle her, but the damage was done. That one spontaneous outburst was worth 100 of his lies. I calmly locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket. My heart was no longer racing. The living room was no longer his stage. Right here, in the very house they thought they had stolen from me, their masks had been ripped off, and I knew this was only the appetizer. After the absolute meltdown in the living room, I assumed Matthew would keep screaming, denying everything, trying to salvage his ego. But no. He went totally silent. And that silence didn't comfort me. It put me on high alert. A narcissist never surrenders by staying quiet. The quieter he was, the more I knew he was plotting something dirtier and more desperate. I wasn't wrong. The next morning, as I walked back into the Wisconsin hospital ward, my phone started buzzing relentlessly. Not calls. Long paragraphs of texts from Matthew. The tone was wildly different, soft, pleading, and so deceptively conciliatory it made me gag. Bella, please. Let's not blow this out of proportion. I messed up emotionally, but the loan stuff is a massive misunderstanding. We're husband and wife. We can handle this privately. Please. I read the message and scoffed. At this point, having the absolute audacity to call forging my signature and moving his mistress into my house a misunderstanding proved his delusion had no limits. I didn't reply. I screenshot the texts, emailed them to Mark, and dropped them into my evidence folder. From now on, his words weren't a husband's apologies. They were the digital footprint of a suspect looking for an exit. But that was just his opening move. By noon, my best friend Lucy called me, sounding frantic. Bella, it's a disaster at the office. There's a rumor spreading through the accounting department that you were the one cheating, that Matthew caught you, kicked you out, and now you're trying to extort him for his money. My blood boiled. It was so vile. He knew he couldn't beat the paper trail, so he decided to nuke my reputation. If everyone thought I was a cheating, unhinged wife, my credibility would be shot. Lucy lowered her voice, sounding sick. That's not even the worst part. Someone anonymously emailed HR doctored photos of you. At a glance, it looks like you're aggressively making out with some guy in a car. I looked closely, the lighting on the neck is totally off. It's definitely photoshopped. But HR is freaking out. I stopped dead in the middle of the hospital cafeteria. If Lucy hadn't tipped me off, if the HR directors weren't tech-savvy, those photos alone could have cost me my career, my income, and my dignity. I leaned against a vending machine, forcing myself to take deep, oxygen-starved breaths. Matthew wasn't attacking my emotions anymore. He was attacking my survival. He wanted me fired and broke so I would be forced to crawl back and accept whatever settlement he offered. And the hits kept coming. Later that afternoon, a charge nurse I had befriended pulled me into an empty alcove. "Isabella, I need to tell you something. This morning, a very strange couple came up to the desk, asking for your father's medical charts. They claimed they were family of the son-in-law and started asking hyper-specific questions about his health insurance, his life insurance policies, and who exactly was visiting him." My hands turned to ice. "Who were they?" The nurse shook her head. "A guy and a girl, dressed nice, speaking very quietly. Luckily, the attending physician put a strict lock on the chart, blood relatives only. So they got nothing." I was paralyzed. Matthew was deploying people to spy on my father in the ICU. He was probing for leverage. He wanted to know if my dad had life insurance he could tap into. Or worse, he was looking for a way to stress my dad out to force my hand. A man who goes to those lengths has entirely abandoned his humanity. That night, after my dad finally fell asleep, my screen lit up with a phone call. It was Matthew. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then hit accept. His voice was terrifyingly smooth, the fake, syrupy tone of a snake coiling before a strike. "Bella, I've been thinking. Let's not turn this into a circus. I'm giving you a chance to walk away with some dignity. Just sign the uncontested divorce papers, let the house go, and I'll let you fade out quietly." I actually laughed. The phrase "giving you a chance" was something only a sociopath could say after forging loan docs, hijacking my house, and trying to get me fired. I kept my voice dead level. "The only person who needs a way out of this is you, Matt." There was a heavy silence. I could hear his ragged breathing through the receiver. The thin veneer of the nice guy shattered instantly. When he spoke again, his voice was a guttural, venomous rasp. "Fine. Then don't blame me when I destroy you." I didn't answer. I hung up. The dial tone echoed in my ear, making the quiet hospital corridor feel freezing. I sat down on a plastic bench, my hands on my knees. I wasn't angry anymore. I was locked in. Matthew was backed into a corner, and when a rat is cornered, it fights dirty. I opened my digital folder and reviewed everything one more time. The audio, the texts, the wire logs, everything had to be bulletproof. If I hesitated now, he would steamroll my life into dust. The threat didn't cost me any sleep, but it kept me in a state of hypervigilance. The next morning, as I was walking out to get coffee, my phone rang. It wasn't Matthew. It was a representative from Chase Bank. With a polite, professional tone, the underwriter asked if I could confirm a time to come into a branch today to finalize the last identity verification step for the home equity loan. I froze. What loan? The employee read off the address of my house, the application number, and noted that the primary applicant, Matthew, had requested an expedited disbursement because of a sudden family medical emergency. My blood ran cold. Just as Mark predicted, Matthew was trying to rush the cash out before I could legally block it. I didn't say much to the bank rep, just that I needed to verify some schedule details, and would call back. I immediately dialed Mark. "He is incredibly desperate," Mark said quickly. "And desperation breeds fatal mistakes. Don't tip him off. Let me call the bank's fraud department. If they cooperate, we are going to drag him onto center stage and execute this publicly." 30 minutes later, Mark called back. The bank's fraud division was fully engaged. They agreed to keep Matthew in the dark, pretending the loan was proceeding. My job was the bait. I needed to lure him to the bank to confess to the forgery. Mark told me to send Matthew one text. "I'll meet you, but you need to explain this to my face." I read the sentence 3 times before hitting send. Less than a minute later, Matthew replied, "Perfect. 11 a.m. at the Chase branch downtown. Glad you're finally using your brain." I felt sick reading it. He was about to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars in my name, and he still thought he was the smartest guy in the room. At 11 a.m. sharp, I walked into the bank. Mark didn't come out with me immediately. He was tucked away in a back office with the branch manager. I sat in the glass-walled waiting area, spine straight, hands folded over my purse. A few minutes later, Matthew walked in. He wore a navy button-down, his hair gelled, trying to project calm, though his eyes darted around frantically. Beside him was Chloe, clutching a designer bag, her face tight with anxiety. As soon as he sat across from me, Matthew leaned back, exuding that familiar, arrogant entitlement. "Glad you came to your senses," he said quietly, like he was doing me a favor. "There was no need for all that drama at the house. Just sign the final verification, and I'll cut you a check for a few grand to start over. Consider it severance for the 6 years." I looked at him with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He was robbing me blind and offering me pennies as a tip. But I kept a poker face. I feigned hesitation. "And what if I don't sign today? What are you going to do?" Matthew scoffed. He glanced at Chloe, then leaned in, lowering his voice with supreme confidence. "Even if you don't sign, I can still get the money. I already have your signature on the master file. You aren't as irreplaceable as you think." My heart jumped, then settled into a cold rhythm. Got him. At that exact second, the door to the back office opened. Mark walked out, flanked by a bank fraud investigator and the branch manager. Matthew's face completely collapsed. The smugness vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer terror. Chloe went white as a sheet, her hands shaking so badly her purse rattled against the desk. The fraud investigator stepped up to the table and spoke in a booming, authoritative voice. "Mr. Last name, be advised that the home equity application utilizing the collateral at your primary residence is officially frozen pending a federal fraud investigation. We have flagged instances of forged signatures and fraudulent declarations regarding marital status." Matthew shot out of his chair, his voice cracking. "What? What kind of bank is this? All my paperwork is legally submitted." Mark stepped forward, dead calm. "Submitted doesn't mean legal, Matthew. We just recorded your verbal admission that you utilized a pre-existing signature belonging to your wife without her consent." Matthew whipped his head toward me, his eyes burning with a hatred so intense he looked possessed. But he had nowhere to run. I tilted my head, looking up at him, and spoke with a voice like a scalpel. "When you sent that suitcase to the hospital, you felt pretty untouchable, didn't you? Why are you sweating now?" Matthew opened his mouth to scream at me, but the bank investigator pulled out a file folder, delivering the final blow. Furthermore, during our secondary verification, we discovered that the authentication phone number attached to this application does not belong to Isabella. It is a prepaid burner phone registered to a Miss Chloe last name. I turned to look at Chloe. She looked like she was going to pass out. "No," she stammered. That's a mistake." But before she could even try to spin a lie, Matthew, completely unhinged by panic, slammed his fist on the table and screamed right in her face in the middle of the bank lobby. "I told you not to use your own name on the burner. Are you entirely stupid?" The entire bank fell dead silent. Tellers stopped typing. Customers stared. Chloe looked at him with massive, horrified eyes, her lips trembling. I didn't need to hear anything else. With that one sentence, they had permanently tied themselves to the crime. I stood up slowly, adjusted the strap of my purse, and looked at them. Matthew and Chloe were already turning on each other, hissing insults, blaming each other for the collapse. All the manipulation, the arrogance, the gaslighting, it was all gone, leaving two pathetic, cowardly scammers turning on each other to save their own skin. I didn't say another word. I turned on my heel and walked out the glass doors. And as the heavy Chicago wind hit my face, I knew my counterattack had only just begun. The second I stepped out of the bank, my phone blew up. It was Lucy again. She was talking so fast she was practically hyperventilating. "Bella, get to the office right now. It's an absolute madhouse. The rumor mill is saying you drained your husband's accounts and ran, and HR just called an emergency all-hands meeting for the executive team." The anonymous emails are everywhere. I stood frozen on the sidewalk. Matthew. After his plot blew up in his face at the bank, he immediately pivoted to his backup plan, destroying my career. Lucy dropped her voice to a furious whisper. They sent a 2-page manifesto to the partners claiming you lack the moral integrity to be chief accountant. I want to punch a hole in the wall. I closed my eyes for 1 second, then snapped them open. I couldn't hesitate. Are the managing partners in the boardroom? Yes, Lucy said. And they are waiting for you. I called Mark. He was brief and tactical. Do not hide. Hiding makes you look guilty. Go straight to the office. Demand an open-door meeting with witnesses. Do not let them corner you in a private room. I drove straight to my corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago. When I walked off the elevator onto my floor, the stairs were suffocating. People glanced at me and quickly looked away. I could hear the whispers. I didn't speed up, and I didn't look down. I walked with my spine rigid and my head high. If you show a single ounce of shame, people assume the rumors are true. The VP of Human Resources was waiting for me near the boardroom, looking a mix of sympathetic and highly cautious. Inside the glass-walled conference room sat 2 of the managing partners. Printed copies of the photoshopped images and the unhinged manifesto were spread across the mahogany table. The senior partner looked at me, his tone serious but professional. Isabella, we need your side of this immediately. This poses a significant reputational risk to the firm. I sat down, placed my phone on the table, and said clearly, I am requesting that this meeting remain open door, and I have asked my legal counsel and a trusted colleague to sit in. I have absolutely nothing to hide. I want this cleared up right here, right now. Moments later, Mark and Lucy walked in. The energy in the room shifted instantly. An employee who brings a high-powered litigator to an HR meeting is not a guilty employee. I had barely started speaking when a commotion erupted in the reception area outside. The receptionist rushed to the glass door, looking panicked. Isabella, your husband is in the lobby. I looked at Mark, who gave a single, curt nod. I understood immediately. Matthew hadn't just sent emails. He was here to put on a live theatrical performance for my bosses, playing the devastated, cuckolded husband to seal my fate. I stood up and spoke to the receptionist. Keep him there. Do not call security to throw him out. I'm going out there. I walked out to the main lobby. Matthew was standing dead center, right where everyone could see him. He had purposefully untucked his shirt, messed up his hair, and rubbed his eyes so they looked bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. As soon as he saw me, he lunged forward, his voice cracking in a pitch-perfect tragic performance. Bella, please. I'm sorry. I know I messed up. But please, don't push me over the edge. I'll give you whatever money you want, just come home. The entire office floor went quiet. Dozens of employees were peeking out of cubicles. A weaker woman might have screamed or tried to drag him away. I didn't step toward him. I stopped 5 feet away and asked, in a voice so flat it echoed off the marble floors. You say I'm pushing you over the edge. Do you want to repeat that in front of the federal bank fraud investigators? Matthew froze. I saw the glitch in his brain. But a second later, he doubled down on the act. Don't threaten me with lawyers. We're married. You don't have to ruin me just to humiliate me. I didn't argue. I pulled out my phone, cranked the volume to maximum, and hit play on the audio from the bank. Matthew's voice echoed through the corporate lobby, loud and arrogant. Even if you don't sign, I can still get the money. I already have your signature on the master file. You aren't as irreplaceable as you think. The lobby went dead silent. The people who had been whispering a minute ago were staring in open shock. Matthew's face cycled from red to a sickly, pale white. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. I stared him down and said, loud enough for the managing partners standing behind me to hear, you didn't come here to apologize. You came here to smear my name so you could keep your job, steal my house, and protect your ego. But you picked the wrong audience. Mark stepped forward and handed the VP of HR a physical copy of the bank's fraud investigation notice, along with proof the photos were digitally altered. The senior partner's face hardened. He announced loudly that the firm would immediately assist in investigating the cyber harassment, and that Isabella's standing in the company was completely secure. Matthew realized he had lost. His mask slipped entirely. He lunged at me, trying to snatch the phone, but 2 building security guards instantly grabbed him by the arms. As he thrashed against them, his face twisted into pure, ugly rage. You bitch! If I go down, I'm taking you down with me. The collective gasp from my coworkers was all I needed. The devastated husband act was dead and buried. I turned my back on him and walked back toward the boardroom, leaving his screams, the struggling security guards, and the stunned faces of my colleagues behind me. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt untouchable. The one unmasked in public today wasn't me. It was him. That afternoon, while I was back at the hospital in Wisconsin talking to my cousin in the hallway, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I frowned and answered. There was a long pause, then a shaky, quiet voice. Isabella, I need to see you, just once. It was Chloe. I stared out at the fading afternoon light. Just a few hours ago, she was sitting next to him while he tried to nuke my life. Now, she was calling me with a trembling voice. I didn't believe for a second she grew a conscience. She was calling because Matthew was throwing her under the bus, and she was terrified. What do you want? I asked flatly. I have to tell you the truth about Matt, she pleaded. Pick the place. Somewhere public. I swear I'm not trying anything. I refuse to go to jail for his crimes. That phrase caught my attention. His crimes. That meant this ran deeper than a forged signature. I told her to meet me at a busy Panera Bread near the highway. I texted Lucy, who immediately said, I'm coming. I'll sit 2 tables away. Mark also gave me clearance. Listen, but offer 0 promises. And whatever you do not feel sorry for her. Chloe arrived 10 minutes late. One look at her, and I knew she was in a state of absolute panic. The smug, perfectly styled girl who wore my pajamas was gone. Her hair was greasy, she had dark circles under her eyes, and she was violently picking at her cuticles. She sat down across from me, her hands shaking so badly she spilled her water. Matt told the bank that the loan was my idea. She blurted out instantly. He said I prepped all the forged documents. I didn't blink. And you expect me to believe you're a victim? The question sliced right through her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she reached into her purse and pulled out a cracked, older model iPhone. She slid it across the table. I know you hate me, but I have receipts. I unlocked the screen. It was open to a WhatsApp thread. It wasn't romantic texts. It was a highly coordinated operation. Matt, keep the burner number off your main Wi-Fi. Matt, I emailed you the HR contacts. Just create a Proton Mail account and send the manifesto. Matt, make sure the Photoshop on those car pictures is clean. Blur the background. I kept swiping. It was a step-by-step playbook on how to destroy my life. But what made my blood run cold was an audio message. I hit play. Matthew's voice played, cold and casual. Just let her keep paying the mortgage for a few more months. When her dad takes a turn and she's out of town, we pull the trigger. Courier her stuff, change the locks. If she comes back screaming, I'll just tell the cops she's unhinged and having a psychotic break over her dad. I stared at the cracked screen. The suitcase wasn't just cruel, it was a calculated psychological weapon. Chloe was quietly sobbing now, wiping her face with a napkin. I thought he loved me. He promised we were getting married, that he was putting the house in my name. He told me you were completely insane, that he hadn't loved you in years. I looked at her with pure disgust. You're an idiot. A man who will forge documents to rob his wife will absolutely throw his mistress to the wolves to save himself. Chloe dropped her head, then looked up, dropping the real bombshell. Matt owes money. A lot of money. To loan sharks. Sports bookies in the city. They've been threatening him. That's why he needed the HELOC cash so fast. He told me if you signed the divorce papers and took on half the debt, he could pay them off and be free. My throat went bone dry. How much? I don't know the exact number, she whispered. But it's huge. Men have showed up at his office. He said if you fought the divorce, the sharks would come after the house anyway. I sat in stunned silence. If I had broken down, if I had just signed the papers to get away from the pain, I wouldn't have just lost my marriage and my home. I would have been legally tethered to underworld gambling debts. The abyss he tried to throw me into was so deep it gave me vertigo. Chloe pushed the phone closer to me. Take it. The photos, the audio, everything is on there. I just ask one thing. When the police ask, tell them I cooperated. I stared at her. The woman who slept in my bed and wore my clothes was now begging for mercy. I felt no pity. I picked up the phone, dropped it into my purse, and stood up. Whether you go to prison or not is up to the district attorney, I said. my voice empty of any emotion. I am not a priest. I don't grant absolution. I walked out of the Panera, leaving her crying into her hands. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the parking lot. I had an absolute arsenal of evidence in my purse, but I knew that to truly break Matthew, I needed to hit him where he had no defenses left. Instead of going back to Chicago, I drove straight back to the hospital in Wisconsin. I sat by my dad's bed, helping him with his water, fluffing his pillows, waiting until he was deep asleep before stepping out into the quiet, fluorescent-lit hallway. Around 9 p.m., my phone vibrated. It was Patty, my mother-in-law. I stared at the screen, then answered. Her voice was unrecognizable. The bitter, arrogant tone was gone, replaced by hyperventilating panic. Where are you? Hospital, I said flatly. I'm driving up there. Don't leave. I need to ask you something. An hour and a half later, she appeared at the end of the corridor. Just seeing her, I knew Matthew's world had collapsed. She was wearing sweatpants and a mismatched cardigan, her hair a mess, clutching her purse with white knuckles. She looked like she had aged 10 years. She collapsed onto the plastic bench across from me. Tell me the truth, she gasped. Does Matthew owe money to dangerous people? I looked at her. The superiority in her eyes was replaced by raw, primal fear. What happened tonight, Patty? I asked calmly. She swallowed hard, tears pooling in her eyes. After I had left the coffee shop, 3 massive guys in leather jackets had shown up at Matthew's house. They banged on the door, screaming his name, making such a scene the neighbors came out. One of them threw a stack of papers onto the front lawn. Promissory notes, photos of the house, and a note saying if Matthew didn't pay up, they were taking the house by force. I thought it was a prank, Patty choked out. But the note said Matt promised them that as soon as he forced his wife to sign the papers, he would have their money. Is it true? I looked at her. When you and your son were throwing me out into the street, did you ever think the wolves would show up at your door? She couldn't speak. Her lips trembled. The ground had opened up beneath her. She wasn't the domineering mother-in-law anymore. She was a woman realizing her son had brought a nightmare to her doorstep. I pulled out my phone. Not out of malice, but because some people only believe the truth when it cuts them. I showed her the forged HELOC application, the wire transfers, and the texts. Then, I played an audio clip from Chloe's burner phone. Matthew's voice played. My mom gets scared easily. She's got a safe full of jewelry and gold coins. If things get really bad with the bookies, I'll just clear out her safe. She'll never press charges on her own son. Patty stopped breathing. Her eyes blew wide open, staring at the phone in horror. She let out a suffocated gasp. He said that? I didn't answer. Her shoulders started to heave. Suddenly, she slammed her fist against her own chest, letting out a wail that echoed down the empty hospital wing. I birthed him. I raised him. And he looks at me like a bank vault? She rocked back and forth, weeping uncontrollably. I watched her, feeling no joy, just a profound emptiness. When greed devours a man to the point that he'll sacrifice his wife and his own mother to save himself, he ceases to be human. Patty looked up at me, her face streaked with mascara. Bella, please help me. Save my house. Save me. I'll testify. I'll tell the police everything he did. I looked at her and spoke with absolute finality. I'm not doing this to save you, Patty. I'm doing this to bury him. Pick a side. She nodded frantically, sobbing. And I knew it was over. Matthew's final shield, his mother had just joined the firing squad. The next morning, Mark orchestrated the finale. We convened at a private conference room at the downtown Chase branch. Present were the bank's regional fraud director, 2 Chicago police detectives, Mark, myself, Patty, and Chloe. Matthew arrived 10 minutes late. He walked in looking utterly hollowed out, but still clinging to a pathetic shred of defiance. The second he saw Chloe sitting in the corner, he pointed a shaking finger at her. It was her. She set me up. She forged the documents. Mark didn't say a word. He let Matthew dig the hole deeper. Chloe jumped up, her face red with rage. Shut up. You told me to buy the burner phone. You told me to Photoshop the pictures. Don't you dare put this on me. The room erupted. The detectives opened their notepads. Matthew froze, then instinctively turned to his mother, falling back on the reflex of a spoiled child needing to be rescued. But Patty wasn't his savior today. She reached into her purse, pulled out the crumpled promissory notes the loan sharks had thrown on the lawn, and whipped them right at his face. The papers fluttered across the mahogany table. "Shut your mouth," Patty screamed, her voice cracking. "You gambled away your life, and you told them you'd steal my jewelry to pay them off? You disgust me." Matthew turned to stone. I saw the exact moment his soul left his body. His mother had abandoned him. His mistress was actively testifying against him. The police were writing down his confession, and his wife, the woman he thought he could discard like trash, was sitting there, holding all the cards. Mark methodically laid out the evidence. The audio tapes, the forged PDFs, the text logs from the burner phone. The fraud director confirmed the FBI had been notified regarding the wire fraud. The detectives informed Matthew he was under investigation for felony, forgery, extortion, and cyber harassment. Matthew was trembling so violently his chair shook. The sweat poured down his face. He looked around the room, realizing every single exit was bricked up. It was an impulse, he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. The bookies were threatening my life. I didn't let him finish. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. The bookies threatened your life, so you forged my signature? You brought your mistress into my bed while I was in the ICU with my father? Was that an impulse? Or are you just exactly what you appear to be, a coward? The room was dead silent. Matthew dropped his head. He had no lies left. At that moment, a commotion broke out in the bank lobby. Through the glass walls, we saw 3 massive men, the loan sharks, shoving past the security guard. The lead guy, wearing a thick gold chain, spotted Matthew through the glass and pointed. "Thought you could hide here, Matt? We want our money today." The detectives instantly stood up, hands on their belts, moving toward the door to intercept them. But the visual was complete. Matthew wasn't just a criminal. He was a hunted animal. Chloe buried her face in her hands. Patty wept into her sweater. And Matthew, totally broken, finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, completely stripped of any pride. "Bella, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "If you just tell them not to press charges, I can fix this." I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and gathered my purse. As I turned to walk away, Matthew lunged out of his chair. He collapsed onto the floor, falling heavily onto his knees right at my feet. He grabbed the hem of my slacks with both hands, gripping the fabric so hard his knuckles turned white, terrified that if I walked out that door, his life was officially over. "I messed up. I swear to God I messed up," he sobbed, tears and snot running down his face. "Please, Bella, I have nothing left. Don't take everything from me." The room was frozen. The bank manager looked away in discomfort. The juxtaposition was staggering. The man who had couriered my clothes in a trash bag with a note saying, "Get out," was now sobbing on his knees, kissing the floor I walked on. I looked down at him. I remembered the cold hospital hallway, my dad's labored breathing, and Chloe in my silk pajamas. I slowly reached down and peeled his fingers off my pants, one by one. "When you packed my suitcase to throw me out, did you ever picture yourself ending up on your knees?" I asked softly. Matthew sobbed harder, his shoulders violently shaking. "Please. Please." I stepped back. "You didn't make a mistake, Matt. You made a choice. You just thought I would be too weak to fight back." Behind me, Patty cried out, "Bella, please! He was your husband. Have some mercy." I didn't turn around. Mark stepped between Matthew and me, his voice a brick wall. "Do not touch my client again. All communication will go through the prosecutor's office." I walked toward the door. I paused with my hand on the glass handle, not out of hesitation, but to deliver the final nail. I looked over my shoulder at the pathetic man crying on the floor. "You aren't on your knees because you love me," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "You're on your knees because you're terrified of losing. And a man like you deserves to lose everything." I pushed the door open and walked out into the Chicago daylight. The sun was blinding, but the air felt incredibly clean. I walked with my spine straight, my head high, leaving the chaos behind me. Over the next few weeks, everything moved swiftly. The legal hammer dropped. I kept the house, the accounts, and every asset that belonged to me. The debt and the criminal charges belonged solely to him. I sold the house, packed my things, and never looked back. My dad slowly recovered. One afternoon, sitting in his sunroom in Wisconsin, I was peeling an apple for him. He reached over, took my hand with his weak grip, and smiled gently. "My brave girl," he whispered. "You finally woke up." I almost cried, not from pain, but from the overwhelming feeling of total liberation. My story doesn't end with forgiveness, a tearful embrace, or a fresh start for a broken marriage. It ends with cold, hard clarity. I lost a husband, but I kept my money, my honor, and my soul. And the man who tried to bury me, the last time I saw him, he was exactly where he belonged, on his knees, with absolutely no one left to help him up.